Loretta Johnson sat on a weathered bench near the fountain, her favorite spot in the park. The rhythmic splash of water mixed with the faint laughter of children playing in the distance. She adjusted her sun hat, a small smile gracing her lips as she thought about her son, Isaiah, who had promised to meet her after work. At 70 years old, her knees no longer allowed for long walks, but this bench had become her haven, a place where she could enjoy the outdoors. Her weekly strolls with Isaiah were a highlight of her routine, moments she cherished deeply. She glanced at her watch. Isaiah was running late, but his demanding work as an FBI agent often kept him tied up. She didn't mind waiting. His company always made it worthwhile. As she waited, a shadow of unease passed over her. 3 men walked toward her from the opposite side of the path. Their laughter carried through the air, loud and harsh, contrasting sharply with the park's tranquility. They appeared out of place, dressed in rough jeans and scuffed boots, their movements deliberate. Loretta's eyes followed them cautiously, her heart sinking as she noticed their gazes locking onto her. One of them, wiry with a permanent sneer etched onto his face, nudged the largest of the group and nodded in her direction. The third man, shorter but equally imposing, smirked without saying a word. "Hey, lady," the wiry man called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Nice day for a stroll, huh?" Loretta stiffened. She didn't reply, opting instead to sit straighter and tighten her grip on her purse. The men exchanged glances, their laughter softening into low chuckles as they veered toward her bench. The path, once lively with other park-goers, now seemed disturbingly empty. Loretta scanned the area, silently willing Isaiah to arrive. She glanced back at the men. They were closer now, their smirks widening as they closed the distance. The wiry man stopped a few feet away, tilting his head as if sizing her up. His smirk carried an unsettling edge, but Loretta kept her gaze fixed ahead, pretending not to notice. "Nice afternoon, isn't it?" he said casually, though his tone was anything but friendly. "Out here all by yourself, huh?" "It is a nice day," Loretta replied, her voice polite but measured. "The park is beautiful this time of year." Her calm response seemed to irritate him. His smirk faltered before returning sharper. "You come here often, lady, or are you just wandering where you don't belong?" Loretta adjusted her purse on her lap, maintaining her outward composure. "I'm just waiting for my son. We walk here together every week." The wiry man chuckled, glancing back at his companions. The largest of the 3, a burly man with heavy boots, let out a deep laugh, while the shorter man grinned silently. "Waiting for your son, huh?" the wiry man continued, his tone laced with menace. "Hope he's not too far away." "He'll be here soon," Loretta replied evenly, though her heart raced. She glanced at her watch again, willing Isaiah to appear. The larger man stepped closer, his boots scraping against the pavement. "Must be nice, having someone to wait on. Some people don't know how good they've got it." Loretta didn't respond, hoping her silence would discourage them. But instead, the wiry man crouched slightly, leaning closer to her eye level. "What's the matter?" he asked, his tone mocking. "We just want to have a little chat. You seem like a smart lady. Don't you want to be polite?" "I don't see why we need to chat at all," Loretta replied firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. The men exchanged amused glances. "Oh, she's got a little attitude," the wiry man said, standing upright. "That's okay. We like a challenge." The burly man let out a louder laugh, stepping even closer to the bench. "Yeah, we do. Don't we, Gary?" The shorter man, Gary, shrugged with a smirk. "She's got some nerve. I'll give her that." The wiry man's expression darkened slightly. He placed a hand on the back of the bench, his posture looming. "You know, lady, not everyone's so lucky. Some people gotta work hard for their spot in the world, and here you are, just sitting pretty. Doesn't seem fair, does it?" Loretta's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "Everyone deserves to enjoy the park," she said calmly, though her grip on her purse tightened. The wiry man's sneer deepened. "Yeah, sure, everyone," he said sarcastically, "but some people don't belong here. You know, they make it uncomfortable for the rest of us." The atmosphere grew heavier, the tension palpable. Loretta glanced at the fountain, its rhythmic splash grounding her. "I don't know what you mean by that," she replied, keeping her tone even. "Oh, I think you do," the wiry man retorted mockingly, but maybe you'll get the hint if we spell it out for you. The burly man, standing closer now, kicked the edge of the bench. The sudden jolt of the bench shook Loretta, making her jump slightly. Her jaw tightened as she steadied herself. Her voice calm, but firmer now. "There's no need for that," she said, her gaze sharp as it flicked between the three men. Troy laughed. A low, unpleasant sound. "No need? Come on, lady. Don't act like you don't know what this is." Loretta's unease deepened. She kept her eyes locked on them, her expression resolute despite the growing tension. "If you're trying to scare me, it won't work," she said, her voice steady. Paul grinned, leaning in just enough to make his presence feel heavier. "Oh, we're not trying to scare you," he said, his tone deceptively light. "We're just saying maybe this park isn't the best place for someone like you." Her stomach turned at his words, but she refused to let their bait get to her. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate breath and lifted her chin slightly. "I have every right to be here," she said, her voice unwavering. Paul chuckled, shaking his head as if she'd said something amusing. "Rights, there's that word again." He glanced at Troy and Gary, a smirk playing on his lips. "You hear that? She's got rights." Troy's laugh was louder this time, darker. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over Loretta like a physical weight. "Yeah, sure you do," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "But maybe you'd be safer somewhere else." Paul reached out, his hand resting lightly on Loretta's arm. The gesture was casual, but the threat beneath it was unmistakable. Loretta stiffened, but didn't pull away. Instead, her voice sharpened. "Take your hand off me." Paul's grin widened, a mix of amusement and menace. He let go and stepped back, holding his hands up as if to appease her. "Relax, lady. We're just having a little fun." Loretta's breath quickened despite her efforts to stay composed. Her eyes darted toward the park entrance again, hoping to see Isaiah appear, but it remained empty. Paul noticed her glance and smirked. "You waiting for someone to come save you?" he asked, his voice dripping with derision. "Hate to break it to you, but this ain't a fairy tale." Troy and Gary moved closer, subtly boxing her in. Loretta's calm exterior began to crack, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "You'll regret this." Paul tilted his head, pretending to be curious. "Oh, yeah? Why's that?" Her response was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of her hope. "Because my son will be here." Paul's laugh was sharp, cutting through the stillness of the park. Troy and Gary joined in, their amusement cruel and echoing. "Your son, huh?" Paul said, shaking his head like she'd just told a joke. "Lady, let me break it to you gently. Your son's not here, and he's not going to save you." Troy leaned against the bench, his arms crossed as he loomed over her. "Even if he was, what's he gonna do? Call the cops?" He sneered. "Like they'd believe you over us." Gary chuckled, his gaze fixed on her purse. "Yeah, they'd probably just figure you're trying to stir up trouble. Maybe even charge you for wasting their time." Paul stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "That's the thing about people like you," he said coldly, "always thinking someone's going to come running to help. But out here, it's just us, and we make the rules." Loretta's fingers tightened around her purse strap, her heart pounding. Despite her fear, her voice remained steady. "I don't need anyone to help me," she said firmly, "and I don't need to explain myself to you." Paul's smirk twitched, the faux charm slipping. "Oh, she's got some fight in her. That's cute, but let's get one thing straight. You're not walking away from here without giving us a little something for our trouble." Loretta's tone sharpened, her resolve hardening. "What trouble? You came over here uninvited. I didn't ask you for anything." Troy let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "This one's got a mouth on her. Thinks she can talk her way out of this." Gary's eyes narrowed, his smirk turning predatory. "Why don't we just get it over with?" Paul held up a hand, silencing them. "Patience, boys. No need to rush." He crouched slightly, his face level with Loretta's. The chilling smile on his lips sent a shiver down her spine. "We're just having a conversation, aren't we, lady? You wouldn't want to ruin the mood by being rude, now, would you?" Loretta's grip on her purse tightened as she held his gaze. "I don't owe you anything," she said, her voice steady. "Not my time, not my belongings." Paul's expression darkened. "See, That's the thing. We weren't asking. It's not about what you owe us. It's about what we're taking. The weight of his words settled over her, but she refused to back down. You wouldn't dare, she said, her voice quieter now. Wouldn't we? Paul straightened, glancing at Troy and Gary. What do you think, boys? You think the lady's right? Or do you think she's bluffing? Troy chuckled, stepping closer. I think she's got something she doesn't want us to see. Bet there's something good in that bag. Gary's grin widened. And that necklace. That's gotta be worth something. Loretta's hand instinctively rose to her necklace, her thumb brushing against the small ring hanging from the chain. Her voice dropped, carrying a warning. Don't touch me. Paul tilted his head, feigning surprise. Touch you? Oh no, lady. We'd never dream of it. His voice turned cold as he grabbed the bench beside her, leaning in. Unless you make us. Loretta's pulse quickened, but her gaze didn't falter. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice low but resolute. Paul's laugh was bitter and harsh. Mistake? No, lady. The mistake is you thinking you're untouchable out here. Nobody cares. Nobody's coming. Gary shifted behind her, his fingers brushing the edge of her purse strap. Loretta jerked back, but Troy was faster, stepping in to block her path. You heard him, Troy growled. Just hand it over, and we'll be on our way. No, Loretta snapped, her grip tightening on the purse. I said no. Paul's eyes narrowed, his smirk twisting into something cruel. Last chance, lady. Don't make us take it. Loretta's hands trembled, but her voice didn't waver. You'll regret this, she whispered, her tone laced with defiance. Paul's smirk returned, triumphant and cold. We'll take our chances. With a quick motion, Troy grabbed the purse, yanking it hard. Loretta's grip faltered under the force, and the bag slipped from her hands. She gasped, her voice rising in protest. Give it back! Gary laughed as he rummaged through the contents, pulling out her wallet. What do we have here? Wallet? Some cash? Not bad. Don't stop there, Paul barked, his attention shifting to the delicate necklace Loretta wore. That too. Loretta instinctively raised a hand to protect the chain. No, she said firmly, though her voice trembled. You're not taking this. Paul stepped closer, his patience clearly wearing thin. Reaching for the necklace, he sneered, It's not up to you, lady. Before he could lay a hand on her, a deep, commanding voice cut through the air like a blade. Let her go. The three men froze in their tracks, startled. They turned as one, their expressions shifting from smug to uneasy. Standing at the edge of the path was a tall man, his broad shoulders taut with tension. His piercing eyes burned with restrained fury, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. Paul's grip on Loretta's necklace faltered as he faced the imposing figure. And who the hell are you supposed to be? He spat. The man stepped forward, his voice low and steady. Her son. Isaiah's words hit like a warning shot, the tone daring any of them to take the next move. Paul tilted his head, his smirk twitching as he tried to mask the unease creeping into his eyes. Her son, huh? He said mockingly. Guess she wasn't lying after all. But let me tell you something, tough guy. You're a little late. Isaiah ignored him, his intense gaze shifting to Loretta. Mom, are you okay? He asked, his voice calm, though the tension simmering beneath it was undeniable. Loretta nodded shakily, her trembling hand brushing over the necklace Paul had tried to steal. I'm fine, she said softly, though her eyes betrayed the fear she had endured. Now that you're here, Paul laughed, though the sound carried an edge of nervousness. Fine? Yeah, she's fine. We were just teaching her a little lesson. Some people need a reminder about who runs things around here. Isaiah's jaw tightened, his body still but coiled with barely contained energy. You call this a lesson? He asked coldly. Harassing an elderly woman? Stealing from her? You don't run anything. Troy stepped forward, his bulk adding weight to the confrontation. And what are you gonna do about it? Call the cops? Like we said, no one's gonna believe her. Or you. Isaiah's eyes flicked toward Troy, his expression unchanging. Try me. Gary shifted uneasily behind the others, his earlier bravado slipping. Maybe we should just let it go, Paul. We got the purse, didn't we? Paul spun around, his glare silencing Gary. You think this is about the purse? This is about respect. Something people like them don't deserve unless they're taught the hard way. Isaiah stepped forward, the distance between him and Paul shrinking with every step. Respect? His voice dropped, each word laced with steel. Is that what you call this? You don't even know the meaning of the word. Paul squared his shoulders, stepping closer until they were nearly nose to nose. The tension between them was electric, a clash waiting to explode. Big words for someone who's outnumbered. Paul sneered. Outnumbered doesn't mean outmatched, Isaiah replied, his tone unflinching. Troy chuckled darkly, cracking his knuckles as he stepped closer. You think you're gonna stop us? There's 3 of us and 1 of you. Pretty sure we win that fight. Paul's smirk returned, but it was hollow. Maybe we should show him, he said, his voice brimming with false confidence. Teach him the same lesson we were teaching her. Isaiah tilted his head slightly, his sharp gaze sweeping over the trio. You don't want to do that. And why not? Paul shot back, his grin widening again. Afraid? Isaiah stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. Afraid? No, but you should be. For a moment, the park seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind stilled as the tension reached its breaking point. Paul's sneer hardened, and Troy took another step forward, his massive frame ready to strike. Isaiah didn't move, his stance grounded, his hands steady. Paul lunged first, his wiry frame aiming a clumsy grab at Isaiah's shirt. But Isaiah was faster. With a sharp sidestep, he dodged Paul's attack and shoved him back with a firm palm to the chest. Paul stumbled, but quickly caught himself, his face red with fury. You think you're tough? He spat, motioning for Troy and Gary. Let's show him what happens when you mess with us. Troy charged forward like a freight train, his fists swinging wide. You're gonna regret this, he growled. Isaiah didn't flinch. As Troy's blow came hurtling toward him, Isaiah ducked under it and delivered a precise jab to Troy's ribs. The larger man grunted in pain, staggering back a step. Gary hesitated, his confidence wavering. Paul, maybe we should shut up and fight, Paul snapped, his frustration boiling over. With a snarl, Paul lunged again, this time aiming low to tackle Isaiah. But Isaiah anticipated the move. Twisting to the side, he grabbed Paul's arm and used the man's momentum against him, forcing him to the ground. With a sharp move, Isaiah flipped Paul onto the ground, the man letting out a pained grunt. Paul's fury burned brighter as he barked an order at the others. Get him! Troy recovered quickly, his face twisting in anger. He lunged at Isaiah, throwing wild punches, but Isaiah's controlled movements made it clear he was no stranger to confrontation. Blocking and dodging each swing with precision, Isaiah waited for the right moment. With a quick and calculated kick to Troy's knee, the larger man crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain. Gary stood frozen, his eyes wide as he took a cautious step back. This guy's crazy, he muttered, fear creeping into his voice. Isaiah's gaze snapped to him, his tone cold and commanding. You're not going anywhere. Gary froze like a deer in headlights, his earlier bravado gone. Paul, still sprawled on the ground, spotted a nearby rock, desperation flashing in his eyes. He reached for it, his fingers curling around the sharp edge. Isaiah! Behind you! Loretta's voice rang out sharply. Isaiah spun just as Paul lunged with the rock, deflecting the attack with his forearm. Without hesitation, Isaiah delivered a precise strike to Paul's shoulder, forcing him to drop the weapon. A fluid motion followed, as Isaiah pinned Paul to the ground, his knee pressing into the man's back. Enough, Isaiah said, his voice firm and unyielding. It's over. Troy groaned, attempting to push himself up, but his movements were sluggish and unsteady. Gary, seeing the situation unfold, decided he wanted no part of it. Forget this, he shouted, turning and sprinting down the path. Coward! Paul yelled after him, his frustration boiling over as he struggled under Isaiah's firm grip. Isaiah didn't budge. His weight kept Paul pinned firmly to the ground. Stay down, he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Troy, clutching his side and grimacing in pain, stumbled away in the same direction Gary had fled. Isaiah's eyes followed him briefly, but stayed focused on Paul, ensuring the man didn't make another move. Loretta approached cautiously, clutching her purse tightly, her breath finally starting to steady. Isaiah, she said softly, her voice tinged with both relief and worry. "Are you all right?" Without looking up, Isaiah replied, "I'm fine, Mom, but we're not done yet." His sharp gaze returned to Paul, who glared back with unrestrained hatred. "You think you've won?" Paul spat, his voice dripping with venom. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." Isaiah leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "The only one who's going to regret anything is you." The distant wail of sirens broke the tense silence, growing louder with each passing second. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Paul's face. His sneer faltered as the reality of the situation began to set in. "You called the cops?" he asked, disbelief coloring his voice. Isaiah didn't waver. "They're not here for a chat." Paul let out a bitter laugh, though it lacked the confidence he had moments ago. "You'll see," he muttered. "They'll let me go. They always do." Isaiah's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He turned to Loretta instead. "Stay close to me, Mom. It's almost over." The sirens grew louder, until the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the path. Shadows flickered across the park as two uniformed officers arrived, their hands hovering near their holstered weapons. They took in the scene, a wiry man pinned to the ground, another limping away in the distance, and an elderly woman standing nearby. "What's going on here?" the lead officer demanded, his sharp tone cutting through the tension as his eyes locked on Isaiah, assessing him as a potential threat. Isaiah raised one hand slowly, keeping the other firmly on Paul's back. "Officer, this man assaulted my mother and tried to rob her," he said, his tone calm and authoritative. "I detained him to prevent further harm." Paul, despite being pinned, managed to bark out a bitter laugh. "Detained? He attacked me? They're going to lock you up for this." Isaiah's lips tightened, but he refused to rise to Paul's bait. He turned back to the officers, his tone steady and deliberate. "I have witnesses and evidence. I'm prepared to give a full statement." The lead officer hesitated, his eyes darting between Isaiah and Paul. Finally, he said, "We'll need you to step back, sir, so we can take control of the situation." Isaiah nodded, lifting his hands in compliance as he stood. He stepped back, allowing the officers to approach Paul, who scrambled to his knees, rubbing his shoulder. Paul glared at Isaiah with unbridled hatred. "You're done! You hear me?" he spat. "They'll take my word over yours any day." Isaiah moved deliberately, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a leather badge case. With a flick of his wrist, he opened it, revealing the unmistakable insignia of the FBI. "Special Agent Isaiah Johnson," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." Paul's mouth fell open, his sneer vanishing as the weight of Isaiah's words hit him. His eyes darted from the badge to Isaiah's face, disbelief and fear flickering across his features. "FBI?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. The lead officer's posture shifted immediately. His hand dropped from his weapon, and he straightened. "Agent Johnson," he said, nodding respectfully. "We'll take it from here." Isaiah inclined his head and stepped back, his focus still on Paul. "Be careful," he warned the officers. "He's aggressive and has a history of violence." Paul's bravado crumbled further. "This is a setup," he blurted. "He's lying. You can't trust him." The second officer stepped forward, pulling Paul's hands behind his back and snapping cuffs onto his wrists. "You can explain that down at the station," he said curtly. Loretta stood nearby, clutching her purse tightly. Her expression was a mix of quiet relief and lingering worry as she watched the officers escort Paul away. Loretta let out a slow, steady breath, her shoulders finally relaxing. "Isaiah," she said softly, her voice carrying both relief and pride. "Thank you." Isaiah turned to her, his expression softening as his focus shifted entirely to her. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked, his concern evident. "I am now," she replied, her voice steady despite the lingering tension. She glanced at Paul, now subdued and far less threatening under the weight of Isaiah's actions, then turned her gaze back to her son. "He didn't expect you to be here." Isaiah's jaw tightened as his eyes flicked briefly to Paul. "People like him think they can act without consequences," he said, his tone firm. "It's time he learns otherwise." As the officers began to lead Paul away, The wiry man twisted his neck to glare at Isaiah. "You think you've won?" he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "This isn't over." Isaiah stepped closer, his gaze steady and unyielding. "It is over. For now. But trust me, the next time we meet, you'll be wishing you'd walked away while you had the chance." Paul's shoulders slumped slightly as the officers guided him toward the patrol car. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the park, a punctuation mark to the shift in power. Isaiah turned back to Loretta, his expression softening once again. "Let's get you home," he said. Loretta nodded, her fingers brushing against the chain around her neck as if to reassure herself it was still there. "I'm ready." Together, they began walking toward the park entrance. The adrenaline of the moment began to fade, replaced by a quiet resolve. But in the back of Isaiah's mind, one thought lingered. Paul's accomplices were still out there. This wasn't over, not yet. As they arrived at Loretta's home, the weight of the day still hung in the air. She set her purse carefully on the table before turning to face her son, her expression both soft and concerned. "Isaiah," she began, her voice quiet, "you've done enough for today. Paul's in custody. Isn't that enough?" Isaiah shook his head, his jaw tightening. "It's not enough, Mom. Troy and Gary ran, and now they think they got away with it. I can't let that happen." Loretta sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I know how you feel," she said gently, "but you've already done so much, more than anyone could ask. You were there when I needed you." Isaiah's tone sharpened, though his gaze remained kind. "And what about the next time? What about someone else's mother, father, or kid? If they're willing to do this once, they'll do it again. I have to stop them." Loretta frowned, crossing her arms. "You think those men are worth all this effort? They're cowards, Isaiah. They'll trip over their own feet without you chasing them. That doesn't mean they shouldn't face consequences." Isaiah replied firmly. "They targeted you because they thought no one would hold them accountable. I won't let them walk away like nothing happened." A heavy silence hung between them before Loretta let out a resigned sigh. Her expression softened as she said, "Just promise me you'll be careful. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you." Isaiah nodded, his voice lowering. "I promise, Mom. I'll handle this." Loretta placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but grounding. "You always have to be the one to fix everything," she said softly. "I'm proud of you for that, but don't lose yourself in the fight." Isaiah gave her a small smile. "Don't worry. I know what I'm doing." Back at his apartment, Isaiah wasted no time. He reviewed the incident reports and began piecing together the information he had on Troy and Gary. His training kicked in as he analyzed surveillance footage from nearby cameras, tracing their movements after they fled the park. Each clue sharpened his focus, and soon he had a breakthrough. He spotted Troy entering a convenience store on the outskirts of town. Cross-referencing the timestamp with the store's transaction records, he found an address linked to a credit card Troy had used. The location was a small, run-down house in a quiet neighborhood. The property looked as neglected as Isaiah expected. Peeling paint, an overgrown lawn, and sagging shutters. Isaiah parked a few houses down and approached with measured strides. Troy sat on the porch, a cigarette dangling from his lips. At first, he didn't notice Isaiah, but when their eyes met, recognition flashed across his face. He stood abruptly, his cigarette falling to the ground. "You," Troy said, his voice thick with anger and panic. "What the hell are you doing here?" Isaiah stopped at the edge of the porch, his tone calm but commanding. "You ran the other day, Troy. That doesn't change what you did." Troy's eyes darted around, searching for an escape route. "I didn't do anything. You got the wrong guy." Isaiah reached into his jacket, pulling out his badge and flipping it open. "Special Agent Isaiah Johnson, FBI. We both know what you did." The sight of the badge seemed to drain the fight from Troy. His mouth opened, but no words came out. After a moment, he managed to stammer, "FBI? That's right," Isaiah said, stepping closer. "And you're coming with me. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Panic set in as Troy stumbled back, his hands raised defensively. "No way! You're not taking me in!" Without warning, Troy bolted, leaping off the porch and sprinting down the street. Isaiah reacted instantly, launching into pursuit. His long strides quickly closed the distance. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Troy's desperation gave him speed, but Isaiah's training gave him the edge. With a final burst of energy, Isaiah tackled Troy to the ground, pinning him with practiced precision. "Get off me!" Troy thrashed and shouted, but Isaiah's grip was unyielding. Troy yelled, his voice tinged with both anger and fear. "You can't do this!" Isaiah leaned in closer, his voice steady and low, radiating authority. "You're under arrest. It's over." The sound of a patrol car pulling up signaled the end of the chase. Two officers stepped out, rushing to assist. Troy's resistance waned as the cold steel of handcuffs snapped onto his wrists. His head hung low, the fight drained out of him. Isaiah straightened, catching his breath. "One down," he muttered under his breath, his gaze hardening as he added, "One more to go." Gary, however, wouldn't be easy to track. Isaiah knew he was a follower, not a leader, but that made him unpredictable, potentially dangerous if cornered. Isaiah needed more information, and there were only two people who might provide it: Troy and Paul. The fluorescent lights in the interrogation room buzzed faintly, their constant hum amplifying the tension. Troy sat slouched in a metal chair, his cuffed hands resting on the table. The defiance he had shown earlier was gone, replaced by nervous fidgeting and the occasional darting glance at the one-way mirror. Isaiah entered the room, his calm demeanor a mask for the frustration simmering beneath the surface. He set a slim folder on the table, its contents a carefully prepared reminder of Troy's connection to Gary. With deliberate slowness, Isaiah pulled out a chair and sat across from him. Troy spoke first, his voice tight and defensive. "Let me save you some time. I don't know where Gary is." Isaiah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened the folder and slid a photo across the table. The image showed Troy and Gary together at the park on the day of the attack. "You expect me to believe that?" Isaiah said, his voice even but sharp. "You ran together. You worked together. And now you want me to think he just disappeared and you have no idea where he might have gone?" Troy shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping against the edge of the table. "Look, I haven't seen him since that day. That's the truth." Isaiah leaned forward, his tone dropping to a dangerous calm. "That's not good enough. You were there when he ran. He's your friend. You know how he thinks. You know where he might hide." Troy shook his head, his voice rising defensively. "Man, I don't know. Gary doesn't tell me everything. He's not the type to stick around. He's probably halfway out of the state by now." Isaiah's gaze didn't waver. "If you're lying, Troy, I'll find out. And when I do, you'll wish you'd cooperated." Troy swallowed hard, glancing at the photo again. His voice dropped. "I swear, I don't know for sure. But Gary's not exactly smart. He panics easy. He might have gone to one of his usual spots." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "What spots?" Troy hesitated, then sighed in defeat. "He used to crash at this motel when things got rough, and there's this bar on the south side, Iron Tankard. He hangs around there when he's got nowhere else to go." Isaiah nodded slowly, his tone cold. "You better hope those are good leads." Troy raised his cuffed hands slightly, the metal clinking. "That's all I've got, man. I swear." Paul was next. Isaiah entered the second interrogation room with the same measured calm, though his frustration had grown. Paul sat with his arms crossed, glaring at the mirror as though daring someone to challenge him. When Isaiah stepped in, Paul's lip curled. "Back for more?" Paul sneered. "You got what you wanted, didn't you? I'm here. Troy's here. Why don't you leave Gary alone? He's not your problem." Isaiah pulled out a chair, sitting across from Paul and fixing him with an unyielding stare. "You made him my problem the second you dragged my mother into this," Paul scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "She got off easy. Could have been worse." Isaiah's hand slammed onto the table, the sound reverberating through the room. His voice was sharp, cutting through Paul's facade. "Don't you dare talk about her like that," he snapped. "You think you're in control here? You're not. The only thing you've got left is a chance to make this easier on yourself." Paul's smirk wavered slightly, but remained. "What do you want me to say? I don't know where Gary is." Isaiah leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low growl. "But you have ideas. Don't play dumb with me. You've known him long enough to know where he'd go when he's scared." Paul's smirk disappeared, replaced by a defensive glare. "He doesn't exactly keep me updated, Agent Johnson." Isaiah arched an eyebrow slightly. So you know who I am. Good. Then you know I won't stop until I find him, and I'll make sure you pay for every lie you tell me." Paul flinched, but quickly masked it with a shrug. Gary's unpredictable. He's got a few places he likes. There's this dive bar, the Iron Tankard. And when he really wants to disappear, he goes to this old cabin his cousin owns, somewhere up north. Isaiah's eyes narrowed. "Give me an address." Paul shrugged again. "I don't have one. It's out in the woods, miles from anything. He only goes there when he's desperate." Isaiah studied him for a long moment before standing and gathering the file. "If I find out you're holding back, Paul, I'll be back. And it won't be a conversation next time." Paul's glare followed him out the door, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his unease. Back at his office, Isaiah cross-referenced the information. Two leads emerged: the Iron Tankard and the possible connection to the cabin. Both required immediate attention, and Isaiah knew time was running out. He parked a few blocks from the Iron Tankard, a dive bar that looked every bit as run-down as he'd expected. Its cracked neon sign flickered erratically, and the faint sound of laughter and clinking glasses spilled into the night. From his car, Isaiah watched patrons come and go, scanning each face for Gary. This was one of the places Troy and Paul had mentioned, a perfect hideout for someone like Gary. Isaiah stepped out of his car, his FBI badge tucked out of sight, and approached the entrance of the Iron Tankard with measured steps. The stale smell of beer and cigarette smoke hit him as he pushed open the heavy wooden door. Inside, the dimly lit bar was clouded with a haze of smoke. Sticky floors and mismatched furniture completed the rundown atmosphere. A handful of patrons nursed drinks at the bar, while a small group played pool in the back corner. Isaiah's sharp gaze swept the room, his trained eye picking apart details until he spotted a familiar figure hunched over a beer at the far end of the bar. Gary. Isaiah's chest tightened with focus as he started walking toward him, weaving through tables and ignoring the curious glances of other patrons. The quiet intensity of his presence demanded attention without a word. As he neared, Gary glanced up. Recognition flashed across his face, and panic followed in an instant. Gary's chair scraped against the floor as he bolted upright, knocking over his drink. "No, no, no!" he muttered, stumbling backward. "Gary," Isaiah said, his voice firm and calm, though it carried an unmistakable weight of authority. "It's over. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Gary's hands shot up defensively, his breathing ragged. "I didn't do anything. This isn't about me. It was Paul. Paul's the one you want." Isaiah's expression didn't waver. "Paul's in custody. So is Troy. You're the last one. Sit down, and we'll talk about how this ends." Gary's eyes darted around the room, panic fully setting in as he realized he was cornered. The bartender and a few patrons were now watching, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding scene. "I'm not going with you," Gary said, his voice shaking. "You're not taking me in. You don't have a choice," Isaiah said evenly, his tone unwavering. "You can cooperate, or we can do this the hard way." For a moment, Gary froze, his panicked gaze flicking between Isaiah and the exit. Then, with a desperate grunt, he grabbed a nearby table and shoved it toward Isaiah before bolting for the back door. Isaiah reacted instantly, sidestepping the table and sprinting after him. "Stop, Gary!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the bar. The patrons scrambled out of the way as the chase spilled into the alley behind the building. The cold night air hit Isaiah's face as he emerged into the narrow alley, Gary already a few steps ahead. The man's frantic footsteps pounded against the pavement. Isaiah's training kicked in as he closed the distance with controlled precision. His movements were steady, purposeful. "Gary, stop now!" he shouted, his commanding voice slicing through the night. Gary glanced over his shoulder, his face a mask of fear. "Leave me alone!" he yelled, desperation driving his flight. He darted around a dumpster, nearly losing his footing as he turned sharply into a side street. Isaiah stayed close, his breathing steady despite the exertion. Gary's erratic movements betrayed his growing exhaustion, each misstep further sealing his fate. Finally, in an empty lot bordered by chain-link fencing, Gary's luck ran out. He tripped over a loose piece of concrete, sprawling onto the ground with a pained shout. Isaiah was on him in an instant, flipping him onto his back and pinning him with practiced efficiency. Gary struggled weakly, his strength sapped by the chase. "You don't have to do this!" Gary gasped, his voice pleading. "I'll tell you everything. Just don't take me in." Isaiah pulled out his cuffs, his voice firm and unyielding. "You've had plenty of chances, Gary. This is over." The click of the handcuffs locking around Gary's wrists seemed to drain the last fight from him. He slumped against the pavement, his chest heaving. "Paul said we wouldn't get caught," he muttered bitterly. Isaiah ignored him, hauling him to his feet. The sound of approaching sirens signaled the arrival of backup. Gary's eyes widened at the flashing lights, his defiance giving way to despair as officers took him into custody. Isaiah stood back, his breathing steady despite the exertion. His mind, however, raced. The hunt was over, but the fight for justice wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and dialed the precinct. "I've got him," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "It's time to make sure they all face what's coming." The next morning, Isaiah parked outside Loretta's modest home. His body still carried the tension from the night before, though a measure of relief accompanied the capture of all three men. He carried a file folder under his arm as he walked up the front steps and knocked on the door. Loretta answered quickly, her warm smile fading slightly when she saw the weight in his eyes. "Isaiah," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "You look tired. Have you eaten?" "I'm fine, Mom," Isaiah said, leaning down to kiss her cheek before stepping inside. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the familiar sense of comfort her home always provided. But his expression remained serious. "We need to talk." Loretta motioned for him to sit at the kitchen table while she poured 2 mugs of coffee. "I take it you found the last one?" she asked as she joined him, setting a steaming cup in front of him. Isaiah nodded, placing the file folder on the table. "Gary's in custody. All 3 of them are. But it's not enough to just arrest them. The case against them needs to be airtight, and your testimony will make all the difference." Loretta's fingers tightened around her mug as she absorbed his words. Her eyes were steady, but a flicker of hesitation crossed her face. "You want me to press charges?" Isaiah's tone softened. "I don't want you to do anything you're not ready for. But if we're going to make sure they face justice, we need your voice. You were the victim, Mom. They targeted you." Loretta took a deep breath, setting her mug down. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "Isaiah, I've spent my whole life brushing off people like them, pretending it didn't matter, telling myself the hate would pass if I just stayed quiet." Her gaze locked onto his, the strength in her voice growing. "But this time, it's different. They didn't just insult me. They tried to hurt me. They tried to take something from me. And they did it because they thought no one would care." "They're wrong," Isaiah said firmly. "People will care. The courts will care." Loretta nodded, her eyes unwavering. "I know," she said, her tone resolute. "That's why I'm not staying quiet this time. I'll press charges. I'll testify. Whatever it takes to make sure they don't do this to anyone else." Isaiah exhaled, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. "I knew you'd say that." Loretta returned his smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm not doing this just for me, Isaiah. I'm doing it for you, for your future, so you don't have to live in a world where people like them think they can get away with anything." Isaiah reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "And I'll be right there with you, every step of the way." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared determination filling the room. Finally, Loretta spoke again, her tone lighter, but still firm. "You know this isn't going to be easy." "I never expected it to be," Isaiah said with a smirk. "But they picked the wrong family to mess with." Loretta chuckled softly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. "You've always been stubborn, just like your father." "Guess I come by it honestly," Isaiah replied, lifting his mug in a small toast. They clinked their cups together, sharing a quiet moment of resolve. The road ahead would be challenging, but they were ready to face it together. The next day, Isaiah stood in the precinct's conference room, leaning over a cluttered table filled with documents. The dim overhead light illuminated police reports, mugshots, and a large map marked with pins representing incidents linked to Paul, Troy, and Gary. Each case had a disturbing commonality. The victims were people of color. Beside him, Melanie Carter, the lead prosecutor, tapped a finger on one of the reports. "This isn't just about what they did to your mother," she said grimly. "This isn't an isolated incident. These men have a pattern." Isaiah nodded, his jaw tightening as he scanned the reports. "They've been targeting people for years. Black families, immigrant business owners, anyone they think is an easy target. They act like no one's watching." Melanie flipped through another file, shaking her head. "Most of these cases never made it to court. Insufficient evidence. Witnesses too scared to testify. They've been skating under the radar." "Not anymore," Isaiah said, his voice resolute. "We're not just going after them for what they did to my mom. We're going to build the biggest case possible. These guys need to be taken off the streets for good." The digging began in earnest. Isaiah spent days poring over old police reports, reaching out to victims and witnesses who had crossed paths with Paul, Troy, and Gary. The pattern of their crimes became undeniable. They targeted people they thought wouldn't or couldn't fight back. One report detailed an incident outside a grocery store where Paul and Troy cornered a young Hispanic man, accusing him of stealing. When the man tried to leave, they blocked his path, shouting racial slurs until a bystander intervened. Another case involved an elderly black couple whose home had been vandalized with racial slurs spray-painted across their fence. Though no one had been charged, neighbors reported seeing Paul and Gary lurking in the area days before. Isaiah tracked down a victim, a cashier at a convenience store, who had been harassed and assaulted by the trio. When he met her at the store, her expression was wary as he introduced himself. "I know this is painful," Isaiah said gently, "but we're building a case against these men. If you're willing to share your story, it could help ensure they never do this to anyone else." She hesitated, her hands trembling as she adjusted her apron. "They called me names," she whispered. "Said I didn't belong here. When I told them to leave, they threw cans at me. One of them hit me in the arm." Her voice broke, but she straightened her back, determination flickering in her eyes. "If it means they finally face justice, I'll talk." The deeper Isaiah dug, the uglier the picture became. Surveillance footage from a gas station showed Paul knocking over a display rack while shouting slurs at the attendant, who appeared too frightened to confront him. A former bar owner confirmed that Paul had threatened one of his bartenders, a woman of Asian descent, after she refused to serve him. Each piece of evidence painted a chilling portrait of their escalating violence. Isaiah sat with Melanie late one evening, the table between them covered in documents. "This is a pattern of racially motivated crimes," Isaiah said, pointing to the stack of reports. "They've been getting bolder, targeting anyone they think they can intimidate." Melanie nodded, her expression grim. "This is more than just one bad day. This is hate, and it's going to be our job to make sure the jury sees that." When it came time to confront the men with their crimes, Isaiah knew they would deny everything. He started with Troy, whose nervous energy was apparent the moment Isaiah stepped into the interrogation room. "You're back," Troy muttered, slumping in his chair. "What now?" Isaiah dropped a stack of photos on the table, images of vandalized homes, assaulted victims, and hateful graffiti. "This is what now?" Isaiah said sharply. "These aren't just isolated incidents. This is a pattern of hate crimes. And you were part of it." "Sicht. This is a hate campaign," Isaiah said sharply, his eyes fixed on Troy. Troy's gaze flicked to the photos spread across the table, then back to Isaiah. Panic flickered in his expression as he stammered, "I didn't do all that. Paul's the one who started it. He gets angry, and we just followed along." Isaiah leaned forward, his voice cold and unyielding. "But you didn't stop him, did you? You threw cans at a cashier. You painted slurs on fences. You were there every step of the way." Troy's shoulders sagged as his excuses crumbled. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. It wasn't my idea." "It doesn't matter whose idea it was," Isaiah said firmly. "You're just as guilty. The only way you help yourself now is by coming clean. Tell us everything." Troy hesitated, his eyes darting nervously toward the mirrored glass. Finally, he let out a shaky breath. "Okay," he muttered, "I'll talk." The information Troy provided deepened the case significantly. He recounted Paul's long-standing rants about teaching lessons to people he deemed unworthy of being in their town. Paul, Troy revealed, had orchestrated most of the attacks, with Troy and Gary acting as willing enforcers. When Isaiah left the interrogation room, he glanced back at Troy, who now sat slumped in his chair, looking small and defeated. The weight of his actions was finally beginning to sink in. "Paul won't protect you," Isaiah said coldly as he opened the door. "The only thing you can do now is tell the truth." The atmosphere in the second interrogation room was electric with tension. Paul sat across the table, his defiant posture a stark contrast to Troy's earlier nervousness. His lips curled into a sneer as Isaiah entered, shutting the door firmly behind him. "Well, if it isn't the hero," Paul drawled, his tone dripping with mockery. "What are you here for now? Didn't you get enough?" Isaiah ignored the jab, dropping a folder onto the table with a resounding thud. He sat down opposite Paul, his movements deliberate and measured. "I'm here to give you a chance," he said evenly. "A chance to explain yourself before the evidence does it for you." Paul chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, I get it. You think you've got me all figured out, don't you? Think you're going to pin everything on me." Isaiah opened the folder, revealing photos, reports, and transcripts. He slid a photo across the table, an image of a vandalized fence with racial slurs scrawled in bold letters. "This was you, wasn't it?" Paul glanced at the photo but didn't respond, his smirk remaining firmly in place. Isaiah pressed on, his tone calm but firm. "We have witnesses who saw you there. Your fingerprints are on the spray we recovered, and Troy's already confirmed that you led the group." At the mention of Troy, Paul's smirk faltered. His expression hardened as he spat. "Troy's a coward. He'll say anything to save his own skin." "Maybe," Isaiah replied, leaning forward slightly, "but the evidence doesn't lie. This wasn't an isolated incident. You've been targeting people, black families, immigrant-owned businesses, anyone you thought couldn't fight back." Paul scoffed, though the flicker of unease in his eyes didn't escape Isaiah's notice. "You don't know a damn thing about me. I know you've spent years trying to make people feel powerless," Isaiah said, his voice hardening. "And now that you're the one caught, you can't handle it." Paul's jaw tightened, but he quickly masked it with another sneer. "You think you're better than me? You think locking me up will change anything?" He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think the system cares about your so-called justice? I've been through this before, Agent Johnson. I'll be out in no time." "Not this time," Isaiah shot back, his gaze unflinching. "We're not just charging you for what you did to my mother. We've got a string of racially motivated crimes tied to you. Vandalism, harassment, assault. Each one is a nail in your coffin." Paul's bravado cracked, his smirk fading into a grimace. "You think you're so smart," he muttered, his voice lower now. "But you don't know everything." Isaiah seized on the shift, his tone sharpening. "Then why don't you enlighten me, Paul? If you've got something to say, now's your chance." Paul hesitated, his defiance wavering as he glanced at the folder in front of him. Finally, he muttered, "Gary's the one you want. He's the one who loses control. I just kept things in line." Isaiah raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "You're trying to pass the blame onto Gary? That's rich. Everyone knows you're the ringleader." Paul slammed his fists against the table, the cuffs rattling loudly. "I didn't force anyone to do anything. They followed me because they wanted to. Gary's just as guilty as me. Maybe more." Isaiah leaned back, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Good. You can tell the jury all about it." Paul glared at him, his breathing heavy, but he said nothing more. Isaiah stepped out of the interrogation room, his mind racing as he processed Paul's words. The man's attempt to deflect responsibility only reinforced what Isaiah already knew. Paul was the linchpin of their operation. The testimonies from Troy and Gary, combined with the mountain of evidence, would cement the case against him. Back in the precinct's conference room, Isaiah met with Melanie to review the latest developments. "Paul's digging his own grave," Isaiah said, handing over his notes. "He's trying to shift blame onto Gary, but we've got enough to show he was the one calling the shots." Melanie flipped through the notes, nodding. "Troy's confession is solid, and the pattern of racially motivated crimes ties everything together. With Paul's arrogance, We might even get him to incriminate himself further on the stand. Isaiah's jaw tightened. Let's make sure we're ready for that. I don't want him slipping through the cracks. Melanie smiled faintly. With this much evidence, he won't. The precinct's conference room had become Isaiah's second home. The table was covered with files, photographs, and timelines as they pieced together the case that would ensure justice was served, not just for Loretta, but for every victim these men had targeted. Stacks of documents and handwritten notes covered the conference room table. Loretta sat across from Isaiah, her face calm but resolute as she sifted through the timeline of events. Beside them, Melanie Carter reviewed her opening statement, her sharp eyes scanning the pages with practiced precision. Everything's falling into place, Melanie said, looking up from her notes. We've got Troy's confession, surveillance footage, vandalism reports, and Loretta's testimony. The jury will see exactly what kind of people we're dealing with. Loretta nodded, but a shadow of doubt flickered across her face. It's just, they're going to try to make me look unreliable, aren't they? Isaiah leaned forward, his voice steady and reassuring. They'll try, but they can't twist the truth, Mom. You've been honest from the start. Just stick to the facts. Melanie chimed in, her tone firm yet encouraging. Exactly. And you have something they don't. Credibility. Paul, Troy, and Gary have a long history of lies and violence. The evidence is on your side. Loretta took a deep breath, setting her mug down with deliberate care. I know, she said slowly, her resolve strengthening. I just want to make sure they don't get away with this. They won't, Isaiah said firmly. Not this time. In the days leading up to the trial, the team worked tirelessly to finalize their case. Isaiah and Melanie reviewed every piece of evidence, ensuring that no detail was overlooked. They conducted additional interviews with witnesses, refining their statements, and pieced together a cohesive narrative designed to resonate with the jury. One evening, Isaiah sat alone in the conference room, the dim light casting long shadows over the stacks of files and photographs. He read through Troy's confession again, each word painting a chilling picture of Paul's manipulative nature and the trio's long history of targeting vulnerable communities. They didn't belong here, Troy had said, his voice shaking during the interrogation. That's what Paul always said, that it was up to us to teach them a lesson. Isaiah's fist clenched as he reread the transcript. The hate behind those words was palpable, fueling his determination to see this case through to the end. At Loretta's home, Isaiah helped her prepare for her testimony. They sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea in front of each of them. Loretta tapped her fingers against the side of her mug, her gaze distant. What if I freeze up? She asked quietly. What if I can't find the right words? Isaiah reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. You won't, he said gently. You've already lived through the hardest part. Now it's about telling your story. Just speak from the heart, and the truth will come through. Loretta smiled faintly, her grip tightening around his hand. You've always believed in me, even when I doubted myself. And I always will, Isaiah replied. You're stronger than you think, Mom. They spent the evening rehearsing her testimony, going over potential questions and practicing responses. Isaiah played the role of defense attorney, asking tough and sometimes leading questions to ensure Loretta was prepared for anything. By the end of the night, her confidence had grown. Her voice was steady, and her answers were clear and sure. The prosecution team also prepared extensively for Troy's testimony. His confession was critical, and Isaiah worked closely with Melanie to ensure it would hold up under scrutiny. He's not a saint, Melanie admitted during one strategy meeting, but his testimony is crucial. If we present it right, the jury will see him for what he is, someone who came clean, even if it was out of fear. Paul will try to paint him as a liar, Isaiah said, his voice thoughtful, but the evidence backs him up. The pattern of behavior is undeniable. Melanie nodded, tapping a pen against the table. We'll make it airtight. As the trial date approached, the weight of the case settled over all of them. Loretta maintained her quiet strength, her resolve unwavering despite the emotional toll. Isaiah worked late into the night, driven by the need to see justice served. Melanie, sharp and methodical, ensured every detail was accounted for. On the eve of the trial, Loretta and Isaiah sat together in her living room, the hum of the television filling the silence. Isaiah leaned back on the couch, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "You've been working non-stop," Loretta said softly. "You need to rest." "I'll rest when it's over," Isaiah replied, though his tone lacked its usual edge. "This is too important to get wrong." Loretta reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "You've done everything you can, Isaiah. Now it's in their hands." Isaiah turned to her, his expression softening. "We've done everything we can. You've been incredible through all of this, Mom. I'm proud of you." Loretta smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And I'm proud of you. No matter what happens, Isaiah, we've already won." "They didn't silence us." Isaiah nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly for the first time in weeks. He allowed himself to relax, if only for a moment. Tomorrow would be a battle, but they were ready. The courtroom fell silent as Loretta Johnson was called to the stand. She rose with quiet dignity, her modest navy suit a sharp contrast to the tension hanging in the air. Her steps were steady as she approached the witness chair, her posture straight, but not rigid. After being sworn in, she sat down, her hands folded in her lap. For a brief moment, her eyes met Isaiah's in the front row. His steady presence seemed to give her strength. Melanie Carter approached the stand with measured steps, her tone gentle but authoritative. "Mrs. Johnson, thank you for being here today. I know this hasn't been easy for you." Loretta nodded, her voice calm as she replied, "I'm here because it's the right thing to do." Melanie gave a slight nod before continuing. "Let's start with that day in the park. Can you describe what you were doing?" Loretta took a deep breath. Her voice was steady, but tinged with emotion. "I was sitting on a bench, waiting for my son. It was a nice afternoon, and I thought the park would be a peaceful place to meet," Loretta said, her voice steady but tinged with lingering emotion. "I didn't think anything of it." "And what happened while you were sitting there?" Melanie asked, her steps deliberate as she moved closer to the jury, her voice inviting them to focus on Loretta's every word. Loretta's hands tightened slightly in her lap. "3 men walked over to me," she said, her tone sharpening. "At first I thought they were just passing by, but they stopped right in front of me. That's when they started talking." "Talking?" Melanie echoed, her tone gentle but leading. "What exactly did they say?" Loretta paused, her gaze momentarily dropping to her hands. When she looked up again, her voice was firm, unwavering. "They called me names. Terrible names. They said I didn't belong there, that people like me shouldn't be in their park." Melanie let a moment of silence stretch, allowing the weight of Loretta's words to settle over the courtroom. The jury shifted in their seats, some glancing at the defendants, who avoided meeting their eyes. "And how did you respond, Mrs. Johnson?" Melanie asked, her voice encouraging but steady. "I told them to leave me alone," Loretta said, her voice carrying both frustration and determination. "I tried to ignore them, but they wouldn't stop. They got louder, more aggressive. It wasn't just words anymore. It was the way they stood over me, the way they looked at me. It was threatening." "Did they make any specific threats?" Melanie pressed gently. "Yes," Loretta replied, her voice rising slightly. "They said no one would care what happened to me, that no one would believe me. They said they could do whatever they wanted, and I wouldn't be able to stop them." Melanie nodded, her expression calm but intense. "What happened next?" Loretta's gaze flicked briefly toward the defendants before returning to Melanie. "Paul Carter grabbed my wrist," she said, her voice tightening with emotion. "He tried to take my purse. When I pulled back, he yanked harder. It hurt." Since Melanie held up a photograph of Loretta's wrist, the faint bruises visible even in the slightly grainy image. "Is this a photograph of your wrist, taken shortly after the incident?" "Yes," Loretta said, her voice steady. "It's from when they documented the injuries." Melanie placed the photograph on the evidence table, ensuring the jury had a clear view of it. "What about the others? Did they assist Paul?" "They stood there," Loretta said, her tone tinged with frustration. "They didn't try to stop him. One of them laughed, and the other blocked me from getting up. It was like they were daring me to fight back." Melanie paused, her gaze steady on Loretta. "At any point, did anyone else step in to help you?" Loretta's expression softened slightly, her voice wavering for the first time. "Yes," she said quietly. "My son, Isaiah, arrived. He stopped them before it got worse." Melanie smiled faintly. "Your son stepped in and defended you?" Loretta nodded, her hands tightening in her lap. If he hadn't shown up when he did, I don't know what would have happened. They weren't going to stop on their own. Melanie turned to the jury, her tone steady but firm. Mrs. Johnson, can you tell the jury how this experience has affected you? Loretta took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I've lived a long life, she began, her tone measured, and I've faced racism before. But this was different. It wasn't just hateful words. It was the way they made me feel, like I didn't matter, like I wasn't even human. It's something I'll never forget. She turned her gaze directly to the jury, her voice rising slightly. But I refuse to let them silence me. That's why I'm here, because what they did was wrong, and someone has to say it. Melanie nodded, stepping back to her table. No further questions, Your Honor. The courtroom buzzed quietly as the jury processed Loretta's testimony. The prosecution had laid a powerful foundation, but the defense was ready to challenge it. As the courtroom settled, Mark Hensley, the defense attorney, rose from his seat. He was a tall man with a crisp suit and an air of deliberate confidence, his every movement calculated to project authority. Adjusting his tie, he approached the witness stand, his expression a mix of faint sympathy and sharp intent. Mrs. Johnson, Hensley began, his tone polite but edged, thank you for your testimony. I'd like to ask you a few questions, if that's all right. Loretta nodded, her expression calm and resolute. Of course. Hensley paced slowly in front of the jury, his hands clasped behind his back. You've stated that my clients approached you in the park and made comments you found offensive. Can you tell us exactly what those comments were? They called me names, Loretta said firmly. They said I didn't belong there, that people like me had no place in their park. Hensley stopped pacing, turning to face her with a slight frown. People like you, those are your words. Isn't it possible you misunderstood their intent? Loretta raised an eyebrow, her voice steady and cutting. No, I didn't misunderstand. They made their intent perfectly clear. And yet, Hensley continued, his tone growing sharper, you claim they threatened you, but no physical harm occurred until my client allegedly grabbed your wrist. Is that correct? Loretta's gaze didn't waver. He didn't allegedly grab my wrist. He did. And he tried to take my purse. Hensley stepped closer to the jury, his voice softening as if confiding in them. Mrs. Johnson, emotions can run high in situations like this. Isn't it possible that, in the heat of the moment, you misinterpreted their actions? Perhaps they were simply trying to engage you in conversation. Loretta's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. If grabbing my wrist and calling me slurs is your idea of conversation, then we have a very different understanding of the word. A ripple of murmurs spread through the spectators, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Hensley's confident facade slipped slightly, but he pressed on. You've mentioned feeling scared, but fear can distort perception, can't it? Isn't it possible you exaggerated what happened because were you afraid? Hensley asked, his tone sharp, attempting to press Loretta into doubt. Loretta leaned forward slightly, her tone unwavering. I didn't exaggerate anything. I told the truth about what they did. Hensley's expression tightened, and he pivoted to a different approach, flipping through his notes with a practiced air of composure. Mrs. Johnson, you've lived in this neighborhood for years, haven't you? Yes, Loretta replied evenly. And during that time, have you ever had issues with my clients before? No, Loretta said, her voice steady. But that doesn't change what happened. Interesting, Hensley said, raising an eyebrow as he closed his notebook with a snap. So, this was the first time you'd ever encountered them. Yet you're certain of their intent, even though you'd never spoken to them before? Loretta's gaze remained steady, her voice calm but firm. I don't need to know someone to understand hate when I see it. Isaiah, seated in the gallery, clenched his fists, willing himself to stay composed. He could see the frustration flickering across Hensley's face as Loretta refused to be rattled. Hensley took a deep breath, visibly recalibrating his approach. He adjusted his tie and offered the jury a faint smile before continuing. One final question, Mrs. Johnson. You've testified that you were waiting for your son in the park that day. Isn't it possible that your son's arrival escalated the situation? That perhaps, had he not intervened so aggressively, This entire misunderstanding could have been resolved peacefully? Loretta's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing slightly as she leaned forward. "If my son hadn't arrived, I might not be here to testify," she said, her voice resolute. "Your clients weren't interested in resolving anything peacefully. They wanted to scare me, to hurt me. My son stopped them before they could go any further." Hensley hesitated, clearly thrown by her response. After a brief pause, he stepped back, his voice clipped. "No further questions, Your Honor." Loretta stepped down from the stand with quiet dignity, her head held high as she returned to her seat beside Isaiah. He gave her a small nod, pride evident in his expression. At the defense table, Hensley leaned close to Paul, whispering furiously. Paul's scowl deepened as he glanced toward the jury, whose members seemed to avoid looking directly at the defendants. The defense's attempt to discredit Loretta had faltered, and the weight of her testimony lingered heavily in the air. The courtroom was tense as Hensley rose to deliver his closing argument. His crisp suit and confident demeanor projected an air of control, even as the momentum of the trial had shifted against him. Adjusting his tie, he strode to the center of the room, his movements deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Hensley began, his voice smooth and polished, "my clients stand accused of heinous acts, but I urge you to consider this case not through the lens of emotion, but through the lens of reason." He paced slowly, his gaze sweeping across the jury. "We've heard compelling testimony from Mrs. Johnson, and while her account is undoubtedly heartfelt, it is not without flaws. Memory, as we all know, can be a tricky thing, especially in moments of high stress. And while my clients may have acted in ways that could be perceived as inappropriate, the prosecution would have you believe this was a calculated act of hate." He paused, letting his words settle in the room. "But where is the concrete proof? Words can be misinterpreted. Actions can be misunderstood. What we have here are allegations, not certainties." Hensley turned toward the defendants, gesturing with an open hand. "Paul Carter, Troy Howard, and Gary Mills are hard-working men, members of this community, who, while imperfect, are being painted as villains in a story based on assumptions and circumstantial evidence." His tone sharpened as he faced the jury once more. "Think about the evidence presented: a bruised wrist, photographs of vandalism, and the testimony of a man, Troy Howard, who would say anything to save himself. Is this enough to condemn 3 men to years in prison, to brand them as racists, as criminals?" He stepped closer to the jury box, lowering his voice for dramatic effect. "Before you decide, remember, doubt is not the enemy of justice. It is its safeguard. And if there is any doubt in your mind about the intentions of my clients, you must give them the benefit of it." Hensley stepped back, his expression resolute. "Thank you." The judge addressed the jury as Hensley returned to his seat. "You've heard from both sides. You've seen the evidence. Now it is your responsibility to deliberate and reach a verdict. Bailiff, escort the jury to the deliberation room." The jury rose, their faces solemn, and filed out of the courtroom. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud, leaving the remaining attendees in a charged silence. Loretta glanced at Isaiah, her hand tightening around her purse. Isaiah leaned close, whispering, "It's out of our hands now." Loretta exhaled softly, nodding. "I just hope they see the truth." The judge cleared his throat. "Court will reconvene once the jury has reached a verdict." The minutes stretched into hours as the courtroom waited. Finally, the doors opened, and the jury filed back in, their faces somber and unreadable. The foreperson, a composed middle-aged woman, held a folded piece of paper tightly in her hands as she approached the bailiff. The air was thick with tension. Every sound seemed amplified: the rustling of the paper, the shuffle of feet, the faint creak of chairs as people adjusted to the weight of the moment. Isaiah sat beside Loretta, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He glanced at her, noting the calm determination in her face, though her hands trembled slightly. "Whatever happens, Mom," he whispered, "we've done everything we can." Loretta nodded, her gaze fixed on the jury box. "I know. I just hope it's enough." "All rise," the bailiff announced. The room collectively stood as the judge re-entered. Once seated, the judge gestured toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, Have you reached a verdict? The foreperson stood, her expression steady but serious. We have, Your Honor. Please pass the verdict to the bailiff. The foreperson complied, handing over the folded piece of paper. The bailiff delivered it to the judge, who unfolded it with deliberate care. His eyes scanned the paper briefly, before looking up. Will the defendants please rise? Paul, Troy, and Gary stood, their faces a mix of defiance and unease as the room held its collective breath. Let me know if you'd like me to continue or refine this further. Chat GPT Rotarista. Here's the rewritten and expanded version of the final section, maintaining the tone and extending it to meet the required length. Troy and Gary stood at the defense table, their expressions a study in contrast. Paul's face remained set in a sneer, his defiance unbroken even in the face of judgment. Troy, however, looked pale, his hands trembling slightly, as though the gravity of the moment was too much to bear. Gary's eyes darted nervously around the room, a sheen of sweat visible on his forehead, betraying his mounting fear. The judge adjusted his glasses, his gaze unwavering as he turned to the jury. In the matter of the people versus Paul Carter, Troy Howard, and Gary Mills, how does the jury find? The foreperson cleared her throat, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. We find the defendants guilty on all counts. A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the sharp crack of the judge's gavel. Isaiah felt a wave of relief wash over him, his tense shoulders finally relaxing as Loretta exhaled softly beside him. Her hands still trembled slightly, but her expression was resolute, her dignity intact. The judge turned his focus back to the defendants, his tone cold and deliberate. Paul Carter, he began, as the ringleader of this racially motivated attack, your actions were not only malicious, but calculated. You targeted Mrs. Johnson because of her race, believing she was vulnerable and alone. The evidence has shown a pattern of hate-fueled behavior over several years. For your crimes, you are sentenced to 18 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Paul's sneer vanished, replaced by a flash of fear and anger. This is a joke, he shouted, his voice echoing in the courtroom as his fury boiled over. Deputies stepped closer, their hands ready to restrain him. The judge ignored the outburst, his gaze now falling on Troy. Troy Howard, he continued, while you participated in this attack and others like it, your cooperation with the prosecution has been noted. However, this does not absolve you of responsibility. You are sentenced to 15 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 10. Troy visibly sagged, his shoulders drooping under the weight of the sentence. The reality of his actions and their consequences seemed to crush him all at once. Finally, the judge addressed Gary. Gary Mills, your involvement, while less direct, was no less harmful. You stood by and allowed these acts to occur, contributing to the harm caused. You are sentenced to 12 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 8. Gary's head dropped, his face pale as deputies stepped forward to place him in handcuffs. The judge banged his gavel once more, his voice resonating through the silent courtroom. This court is adjourned. Let this serve as a reminder that acts of hate and violence have no place in our society and will not go unpunished. As the defendants were led out, Paul turned his head, his voice dripping with venom. You think this is over? You think you've won? Isaiah met his glare with an unflinching stare. It's over, Paul. You just don't realize it yet. Outside the courthouse, Loretta and Isaiah stood on the steps, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. A crowd of reporters swarmed them, microphones and cameras thrust toward their faces as questions rang out from all sides. Isaiah shielded Loretta from the chaos, guiding her through the crowd with a firm yet gentle hand. Once inside the car, Loretta let out a long, shaky breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. They're going to pay for what they did, she said quietly, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. Isaiah nodded, his own tone calm and assured. They are, and they won't hurt anyone else. The days following the sentencing were quiet, a stark contrast to the intensity of the trial. Loretta spent her evenings on the porch, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, watching the soft light of the setting sun bathe the yard in a warm glow. One evening, Isaiah joined her, settling into the chair beside her. His presence was a steadying anchor, the calm after the storm they had weathered together. "They're gone now," Loretta said softly, her eyes on the horizon, locked away where they can't hurt anyone else. Isaiah nodded, his gaze steady. "It doesn't erase what they did, but it stops them from doing it again. That's something." Loretta sipped her tea, her hands no longer trembling. "I've lived with this kind of hate for a long time, Isaiah, but standing up in that courtroom, it felt different. Like I wasn't just fighting for myself, but for everyone who's ever felt the same way." "You were incredible, Mom," Isaiah said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You showed people that silence isn't the only option." Loretta turned to him, her smile faint but genuine. "And you, Isaiah, you've been my rock through all of this. I don't know how I would have done it without you." Isaiah leaned back, his expression contemplative. "We did it together, and now maybe things will start to change." Loretta nodded, her eyes glistening as the emotions of the past weeks caught up to her. "Maybe, and if not, we'll keep fighting for the next person, and the one after that." The two sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the trial slowly lifting. The world outside still held its challenges, but for now, in this quiet moment, they had found a measure of peace. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. For Loretta and Isaiah, it marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a world where they had stood up, spoken out, and refused to be silenced. Together, they had proven that hate would not have the final word.